Well, good morning. It's good to be here today. And I am so ready to talk about the fifth sign that we find in the book of John, the fifth sign. This is going to be a lot of fun. And actually, I've got some things that are interesting and may challenge you a little bit, uh, but it's there, and I want to talk about it. So we're going to be talking about the fifth sign, and it's Jesus walking on the water. Okay, and it's interesting because it's kind of all tied in. And if you remember, we they just got through feeding the 5,000, and this is when Jesus walked on the water. We find this in John chapter 6, verses 16 through 24. Let me go ahead and read this. It says, uh, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across to Capernaum. Had already set in, darkness had already set in. Excuse me, but Jesus had not yet come to them. Then a high wind arose, and the sea began to churn. After they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea. He was coming near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him on the boat, and once the boat was at shore, where they were heading, okay, and he says this. He says the next day, the crowd had stayed on the other edge of the sea, knew that there had been only one boat. They also knew that Jesus had not boarded the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone off alone. Some boats from Tiberias came near the place where they ate the bread after the Lord had gave thanks. Um, when when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum looking for Jesus. Okay, so we had talked about this yesterday about feeding the 5,000, and then wanting to take him and put him on the throne as king, as Messiah. And there are two other actual accounts of the same event, and one of them is in Mark, and we'll read this too. Mark chapter 6, verses 45, starting at verse 45. It says, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, where he dismissed the crowd. After he said goodbye to them, he went away to the mountain to pray. Okay. When evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea. He was alone on the land, and he saw them being battered as they rowed. Because the wind was against them, and around 3 in the morning, he came toward them walking on the sea, and they wanted to pass them by. When they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately, he spoke to them and said, "Have courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Then he got into the boat and with them, and the wind ceased, and they were completely astounded. Okay, now the reason they were afraid is that there was a mariner's uh, whatever you call it going around. It was a legend or something that went around that said that you'll before you die you'll see a ghost. Okay, and so they thought he was a ghost, and so they all were convinced that they were going to die, and so that's why they looked at him as a ghost. The other thing is he said, "Don't be afraid," and I he said, "Have courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." I think that they calmed down when they heard his voice because I think that they knew his voice, and that's one of the good lessons for us today. But the other event is, or the other time that it talks about it is in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Starting in verse 22, it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After dismissing the crowds, he went up on a mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was already over a mile from land, battered by the waves because the wind was against them. Around 3 in the morning, he came toward them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him on the shore, or on the sea, excuse me, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them. Have courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Lord, if it is you, Peter answered him, command me to come to you in the water. Come, he said, and climbing out of the boat, Peter started walking on the water and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the strength of the wind, he was afraid and begins to sink. And he cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately, okay, immediately Jesus reached out his hand, caught hold of him, and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Okay, so and then those in the boat worshipped him and said, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Okay, so what right here they've identified him as Messiah or King, and that's the term is the Son of God. Okay, that's what they were saying about him. Okay, and it's kind of interesting because in this it added Peter getting out of the boat and so forth. And if you notice that Peter began to sink once he took his eyes and his mind off of Jesus. What he did was he if you it says in the narrative, he looked at the wind and he looked at the waves and he saw how strong they were. And at that point, he became afraid and began to sink. Now, see, that's the trouble, is that we need to keep our eyes and our focus on Jesus, because if we let anything else get in the way, it stirs up our fear and causes us to begin to sink. Fortunately, Peter cried out, and Jesus took hold of him and got him to the boat and so forth. But one of the things he said in it to Peter, "Oh, ye of little faith," okay, why did you doubt? And that's an important issue. But I want to talk about Peter too, because in First Peter he says something that is kind of interesting, and it's really kind of about it's going to tie into this. So just bear with me. If you look at First Peter chapter 3, verses 20 through 21, it says, in that state he was also went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison. That's talking about Jesus, who in the past was disobedient when God patiently waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared. It in it, a few, that is 8 people, were saved through water. Now this is interesting. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not the removal of filth of the flesh, but the pledge of good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Okay, so he's not talking about getting wet. He's talking about something else, and I want to take a look at it. But what he did was he identified Noah and the ark as part of this narrative. So I want to take a look at that. Interesting. It looks like if we look into Genesis chapter 6, verses 13 and 14, the words are important here in the original language. Okay, verses chapter 6, verse 13 of Genesis. Uh, chapter 6, verse 13 and 14. It says, Then God said to Noah, I have decided to put an end to every creature, for the earth is filled with wickedness because of them. Therefore, I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. make rooms in the ark and cover it with pitch inside and out. Now it's interesting because I want to start showing it here. You don't see this in the English. We can't see it in the English, but in the original language, in the Hebrew, you can see this. The word gopher, okay, for gopher wood, the wood gopher can be translated house. Okay, so if we look at this, and the word pitch can be translated atone or atonement. Okay, so the same word used in pitch was used in pitch on Moses' basket, and which is atone. Okay, so when he was a baby and they floated him in the Nile. Okay, before the Pharaoh's daughter picked him up. So God would have been telling Noah, take his family into the ark, and he would close the door and atone for them there. Isn't that amazing? That's the original language, and that's why it's so important that we take a look at some of these things. Even more interesting, in Genesis chapter 7, verse 18, um, he we can read this. It says, and the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. Now, the word went in the Hebrew is not what you think it is, okay? In the Hebrew, the word went is walk, okay? And it's in this, this is funny because in this, for one verse, it's the only place where that Hebrew word is used in connection with the boat. Okay, but the word Hebrew word is halach, and it means to walk. This is why Peter says that the ark is a type of Jesus or Messiah. Okay, so he actually shows us the type, if you will, of this whole thing. And this is what he was talking about. And this is the tie-in with him walking on the water. And this is the thing that showed that he was Messiah. Okay, and they identified him in the boat as Messiah. They identified Scripture, Old Testament Scripture identifies him as Messiah as well, and the atonement and the job that he does and that he did. What an amazing nugget for us to go by.